Hello everyone, welcome to another day in the clown decade, and today we find out that one of America's most leftist magazines is only just now finding out what conservatives actually believe in, because as we have known for quite a while, they don't really care, and they don't really read anything outside of their own echo chamber, so we may as well get into it. So, from Jacobin magazine, which gets its name from the 1938 book The Black Jacobins, Toussaint Louverture, and the San Domingo Revolution, which in other words is just the French Revolution but in blackface, they decided to come out with this absolute cracker of a title. Reading Edmund Burke shows that conservatism is all about defending traditional hierarchies. If you are serious about politics in any sort of capacity, you should know that conservative means keeping traditional hierarchies intact. Studying the writing of Edmund Burke, the father of modern conservatism, reveals something important: that right-wing intellectual thought is little more than a series of dressed-up defences of conventional social relations and traditional hierarchies. So this is embarrassing for quite a number of reasons, the main reason being that that is just simply underselling and understating exactly what Edmund Burke was writing about. Because Edmund Burke had about over 40 years of writing on subjects mainly focused on political matters, but also philosophy and religion. Even if you hate right-wingers, you can't just say that 40 years of writing on politics, philosophy and religion can all just be summarised as dressing up conventional social relations and traditional hierarchies. Clearly there's got to be something slightly deeper than that. Because I hate Karl Marx and all politics that have stemmed from Karl Marx, but I don't think I'd ever summarise him seriously as a left-wing intellectual who thought up little more than a series of dressed-up defences of overthrowing capitalism and the ruling class. Because I know that wouldn't be true. I also know that he sent a lot of letters to Engels asking for 2 bob to pay for the rent, while he had massive boils on his bum because he spent so much of his time sitting down. Speaking of, I should probably go for a run after this video. But as we have such a ridiculously reductive subheader, let's get into the actual article. Edmund Burke occupies a venerable position in the history of right-wing thought, often described by friend and foe alike as the father of modern conservatism. No doubt this would have surprised the opinionated Irishman, who largely saw himself as a practical politician with nothing but disdain for pretentious intellectual scribblers. He sounds just like me, except I'm only slightly Irish. But no one gets to decide how history will remember them, if it deigns to, and Burke's most enduring legacy has proven to be his extensive writing on politics and aesthetics. So already from this first paragraph we can tell that he did an awful lot more than just defend social traditions and traditional hierarchies. Burkeanism is a mercurial and even intentionally ambiguous way of approaching the world, one that regards the human capacity to reason as fundamentally limited and consequently venerates established social relations and the wisdom allegedly embedded in tradition. In many ways it's fundamentally anti-modern, and it has indelibly stamped the history of conservative thought. This article is brimming with language where the author is clearly seeing something in this writing that he is finding hard to argue with, and so he is having to poison the well pretty heavily in these first few paragraphs and obviously the title. Because it is true that Edmund Burke essentially said there's a reason we have traditions and it's silly just to get rid of them because we can, and the French Revolution really did fundamentally make him think that just getting rid of tradition and the way your country works just because you can and you're angry at the moment is not the way to go about it, because he saw the ridiculous amount of violence that entailed and how much of a mess France was at the time and how its new leaders acted, and they all acted in either completely mental ways like Robespierre, or they turn into military dictators like Napoleon. So naturally, if you see the choice of get rid of everything and we get this, or keep the old way that we had where we can see a lot of good in that, obviously he's going to defend the good there. So moving on to the sublime and the beautiful. Despite his later revulsion at ne'er-do-well philosophers, Burke began his life as something of a bohemian intellectual. He travelled the European continent engaging with the controversies of the era, but he was always uncomfortable with the most radical streams of contemporary thought, probably because he went around Europe seeing the consequences of that. Burke's most important early book was a philosophical inquiry into the origin of our ideas as the sublime and beautiful, a work of aesthetics that would become influential enough to be cited by luminaries such as Immanuel Kant. Burke's prioritisation of aesthetics and the way he sees the beautiful and sublime as influencing human passions is telling. For Burke, contrary to today's facts don't care about your feelings type, our emotions determine a great deal about how we apprehend the world, and our feelings are stirred one way or another by viscerally aesthetic ideas. So this is the funny thing, as soon as this article goes into what Burke actually did with his life, and talks about what he actually wrote about, it turns out that no, it isn't just a load of facts and writings to defend social hierarchies and traditional values or anything like that. It turns out he went around and talked about art, and talked about how art and aesthetics of such divine beauty and art that is sublime can influence human passions, human thought, and human emotions. Things that, as the article points out neatly, isn't the type of thing that an awful lot of right-wingers are saying today, apart from the late Roger Scruton, and in some ways, Jordan Peterson. As the title indicates, the two most significant ideas Burke discusses in the book are the beautiful and the sublime. Insisting that beauty is no creature of our reason, Burke goes on to describe beautiful things as those that comply with our finite mental and physical strength. In other words, those over which humans can wield some control. Birds, flowers, harmonious music, and so on. The sublime fills us with astonishment and horror, something so titanic and powerful that we are reminded of how finite our strength is, both mentally and physically. No issues with anything he said there, but I don't see how this is a dressed-up defence of traditional values. But there we go. Our idea of the sublime also exceeds reason. Our effective idea of it, the strongest emotion which the mind is capable of feeling, can give us some sense of the sublime's transcendent power and infinitude, but is never enough to represent it fully. Epic poetry, for instance John Milton's Ruminations on God and the Infinite in Paradise Lost, is probably the closest we can get, or at least the closest we've discovered so far. The two dimensions Burke sketches out have come to define a great deal of right-wing theorising. At times, conservatives echoes Burke's reflections on beauty through a critique of modernity as indifferent to the small and local, the rationalistic giant state being an exemplar. Well, with the way new builds are looking these days, I can't exactly disagree with him. Modernity swallows up, as a conservative jurist Robert Bork put it in his book Coercing Virtue, particularly respect for different circumstance and history, nostalgic variants of conservatism emphasising the virtues of rural life, conformity to settled practices and values, and respect for conventional authorities all appeal to this side of Burke's aesthetics. I mean, is wanting tranquil places and rural life a bad thing? I don't think it is. That's why, as much as I hate NIMBY arguments, I can't come to actually fully hate them, because I know it comes from a place where people just want a peaceful life, essentially, and I can never complain about that. However, new houses would be very nice, please and thank you. Then there are the more grandiose variants of conservatism, which have no problem appealing to the gigantic. One of the problems these conservatives have with liberals and left-wing humanists is precisely the conceit that anything as small as human life can have meaning without some transcendent and awe-inspiring source of authority and power to vindicate it. I've got to agree with that. The source of transcendent meaning might vary. The patriarchal God, the father, the nation, the eternal tradition, Western civilization, but a sublime source there must be. What unites both these right-wing strands is their suspicion of reason as a foundation for life, and emphasis on effect, and more important, power and difference. Burke admires the beauty in the same way. Later conservatives wax poetic about the virtues of rural traditionalism. Both embody a form of life characterised by regularity, a sense of order and harmony, and a realisation of our limited reason and power. To behave otherwise, conservatives argue, is to bring about chaos, or even worse, to fall into some kind of Luciferian hubris, questioning what should be merely revered and obeyed. I am once again not particularly shocked that a leftist has written a whole 5 paragraphs and not really said an awful lot. I have to say, though, it's better than The Guardian, but all that's really been said here is Burke said some things about beauty and the sublime. Quite a lot of modern-day conservatives agree with it. Well, yes, that does tend to be what happens when someone is regarded as the father of a movement. The rest of the movement will reference him and tend to agree with a lot of what he said. However, given this is a full-on leftist magazine, I would love to hear why wanting any of that is a bad thing. So naturally, it doesn't tell me that, it just moves on to Burke's Gothic political outlook. Okay. One of the first critics to recognise the link between Burke's aesthetics and his politics was the English philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft. Drafting a response to Burke's reflections on the revolution in France, Wollstonecraft criticised him for elevating vague Gothic notions of beauty over reason and analytic precision. As she put it in her Vindication of the Rights of Men, I perceive from the whole tenor of your reflections that you have a mortal antipathy to reason. But if there is anything like argument or first principles in your wild declamation, behold the result, that we are to reverence the rust of antiquity and term of unnatural customs, which ignorance and mistaken self-interest have consolidated. The sage fruit of experience, nay, that if we do discover some errors, our feelings should lead us to excuse, with blind love or unprincipled filial affection, the venerable vestiges of ancient days. These are Gothic notions of beauty. The ivy is beautiful, but when it insidiously destroys the trunk from which it receives support, who would not grub it up? I have to say, I do love the way that centuries-old philosophers did write about each other's arguments. It's put so eloquently in those days, and these days, I mean, I'm not really of any help in improving the culture, but it is just a lot of insults towards each other that are relatively puerile compared to these fanciful words. But even this response to Burke is missing his point. He's not saying hold on to things such as the ivy that will be destroying the trunk. He would say keep the part of the ivy that is beautiful and not destroying the trunk. Burke never argues that we should just keep traditions in place because they are there. He says when you do question a tradition, you need to understand fully why it's there in the first place. And if you try and use pure rationality and pure reason for that, you're going to find holes in absolutely everything we do, because humans are not rational creatures. This was a savvy observation, as Corey Robin and others have observed. Many Conservatives down to the present day dress up arguments for deferring to tradition and authority with a gloss of unknowable profundity. Often, they're successful in inspiring sympathy because many people do feel a genuine sense of loss at the sight of traditional hierarchy subject to attack. Nevertheless, when egalitarian movements are on the march, sublime institutions and creeds that were formerly respected and defended come under relentless scrutiny and critique. The rhetorical flash and bang, jazzing things up, obscuring the unknowable and transcendent, fall away. Like the titular magician in The Wizard of Oz. The wizard in The Wizard of Oz. Why say magician? Various forms of traditional power are exposed as crusty elites defending their privileges. And conservatives, grudgingly as Edmund Fawcett points out in his excellent Conservatism, A Fight for Tradition, are forced to spring into action, providing intellectual defences of what they simultaneously claim cannot be adequately grasped by the intellect. I mean, it's a good thing that they poison the well at the start, because now they can just assert the same thing without really saying too much. I don't know who Corey Robin is, but they've cited him, but not actually cited what he said. And the thing is that because leftists have, quite frankly, been at the levers of power in some industries for so long, that they do the same thing. Whenever the right come with a rational look at something like, I don't know, the BBC and the licence fee, all of a sudden, all of these leftists come out the woodwork, and when they've been saying that it's right-wing for years and years and decades, all of a sudden they want to defend the licence fee and say, no, don't get rid of the licence fee. This is something that we've had for years, when in reality, it's what did we have it there for in the first place? Well, it was to educate, entertain, and whatever the third E was. It's not really doing those things anymore. It's certainly not educating people because it keeps getting facts wrong. Entertainment, well, that's subjective, but as we can see from view counts of their flagship shows, it's not as entertaining as it was, so there's no reason to keep it as a government institution anymore. Leave it to the market, see what they have to say. The apparent paradox of this claim reflects a long-standing conservative belief that ultimately it would have been better if no one had questioned these institutions and creeds in the first place. It's not the conservative argument. Not coincidentally, Burke was one of the first to express a complex aversion to intellectualism, while recognising the need to provide some kind of argument for conservatism against its enemies. Government is not made in virtue of natural rights, which may and do exist in total independence of it. That's true. It exists in a much greater clearness and a much greater degree of abstract perfection, but their abstract perfection is their practical defect. By having a right to everything they want, everything, society requires not only that the passions of individuals should be subjected, but that even in the mass and body as well as in the individuals, the inclinations of men should frequently be thwarted. their will controlled and their passion brought into subjection. In this sense, the restraints on men, as well as their liberties, are to be reckoned among their rights. I'll reword that because it was written by Burke years ago. He is saying that a lot of people on the left wing want a right to everything. And because they want a right to everything, that means they actually just want everything. But the thing is that natural rights, which is an idea which has been about for years, and comes about from irrationalistic human nature, over years those abstract ideas have been perfected. And these new rights that are coming out of rational thought and almost out of nowhere, they demand that the passions and the body of individuals be subjected to the government, which, as he says, is not made of the virtue of natural rights. Natural rights have always been there, but it does enforce natural rights, which is the point he's making. And then when the government starts enforcing other rights that aren't natural rights, men will start losing their freedom. This kind of thinking would have an enormous influence on conservative thinkers going forward, but Burke rarely provides an extensive philosophical argument for why any of this is less abstract than the apparently vague rationalistic principles of his opponents. Well, as I just went through, it's because they have stood the test of time and can survive human irrationalism. Often he merely ridicules his foes and asserts the obviousness of his own preferred principles. It's pretty Chad. The argument frequently boils down to claims that his favoured prejudices and practices have proven their worth over time, unlike the new and untested ideas put forward by his opponents, which I think is a fair argument when we are talking about traditions and how we should run the world. Conservatives today will often point out that Burke's prophecies on the potential violence of the French Revolution proved accurate, suggesting we should give him some credit. If you can predict the future right based on your philosophy, writing and observations, yeah, I think you deserve pretty good credit for that. But it's also worth noting that most of these institutions and prejudices Burke felt were necessary for an ordered society. Respect for the crown and aristocratic property, distrust of democracy and the intellectual abilities of the Swinish multitude, the political subordination of women to men, would all be discarded rapidly after his death. And as we are losing some of these institutions, things are getting worse and worse and worse. You'd be hard-pressed to find anyone but the most out-of-touch reactionaries defending them now. Meanwhile, the principles and ideals of the French Revolution and the modern world they embodied live on and continue to inspire millions. Yes, France is currently having a massive issue with riots and churches are constantly being burned down. And all over Europe there are waves of rejections of leftism. The ADF are resurging in Germany and they're basically UKIP plus. The good, the bad and the ugly in Burke. Burke's writings contain some elements of truth. Any sensible person should recognise their mental limitations and not assume that they can process a complete understanding of the world. Yes. There is also many traditions and ways of life that have been needlessly corroded, often by the force of capitalism. The inverse error of Burke's bias towards the old is to fetishise the new. It's so annoying when capitalism is blamed for things like that, because one of the most traditional times in the UK was during the Victorian era, when we did have pretty close to unfettered capitalism and free market trade, and it was one of the most morally righteous times in history. The fundamental problem with Burkean arguments, as Wollstonecraft and others have argued, is their hostility to so-called rationalist abstraction and appeals to effect and the profound unknown are only sustainable for those who already feel the way that they do. This is why Burkeanism has been described as less a philosophy than an outlook or attitude. An attitude pivoting around aesthetic sensibilities doesn't get you very far. As Ian Shapiro notes, one person might feel deeply attached to a venerated if mysterious tradition, while another might view it as a grotesque form of domination. Okay, the only way we can suss out which is right is by leaving the ethereal realm of aesthetic vagueness and putting confidence in our limited powers to understand the world that it is. But if, as you say, our limited powers bring us to the wrong conclusion, millions die. So a lot of the time I am more than willing to stay in the realm of aesthetic vagueness when it comes to a tradition that isn't killing people, because a lot of the times in the other sense it obviously ends with bloodshed. And of course sometimes if we do have a tradition, it's fair enough to go on, try and interrogate it and find good reasons to actually stop that tradition. A good one would be slavery. Another one would be widow burning in India. The important thing to take away from Burke's writing isn't that he is saying never change anything ever. That isn't his point. His point is that if you are going to change something, you need to deeply think about why it is there, and you don't necessarily have to be rational about it. And if it is causing harm, obviously there needs to be some form of reform to it. And this is what conservatism is all about. It's not about keeping everything the same no matter what and never change anything. That's just ridiculous, and I don't even think reactionaries would go that far. But I have many doubts that this leftist even tried to vaguely understand what Burke was saying in any of his books or writings, and seemed a lot more concerned with what his critics have to say, which I, can't really blame him for. If you read someone who is so profound and excellent at dismantling your own arguments, you're not going to want to take him too seriously. Conservatives who channel Burke will always resist the move to irrational, since if we can understand the world as it is, we would have it in our power to remake it. I don't think that necessarily follows. Leftists always need to start bearing in mind that the human being is an irrational being. You can rationalise absolutely everything we do in life, but most people do the things they do in life for completely irrational reasons. Why do I spend literally thousands of hours playing video games? There's no rational reason for it, and I know it, but I know I enjoy it, and therefore I do it. Now some people might say, well, there's your rationale. Yes, but it's not rational to spend literally thousands of hours on them when I could be doing something much more productive and much more meaningful. This is precisely what they do not want, and it's exactly what we must set out to do. So the leftists read Edmund Burke and thought, yes, we need to rationalise even more. That was their main takeaway. This has to be one of the worst articles I think I've ever read. It was an opinion piece about a conservative philosopher, and I think they had one quote from the actual philosopher they were talking about. The rest of the time it was from critics of said philosopher, which, if you're going to do a short article about what a philosopher says, I wouldn't even bother citing the critics. I would instead cite everything from said philosopher you are talking about and come up with your own criticisms. And if you are going to quote the people, at least expand on what they have to say rather than just put the quote up and then move on pretty much straight away. But really, as expected, there was nothing really said against Burke here, other than he says there's no real need to rationalise everything, and they don't really have an opposition to that. It's just that for rational or irrational reasons, they are against certain traditions and hierarchies and whatever, and to argue against that, you need to be as hyper-rational as possible, when that's not how the human brain works, as Jonathan Haidt has written about in The Righteous Mind. Your positions ultimately come from your own intuition, which we're not entirely sure, but it partially comes from a deterministic standpoint, i.e. your genetics, and partially, of course, from your upbringing and your environment. Of course, both have an effect on you. There's no way around it. Now, the reason you say you hold these positions, that entirely comes down to the rational mind. That is, the elephant and rider. The elephant is your position and takes you to your positions. The rider is explaining why you do it. And Burke was just honest. He realised his elephant, went to this sublime and beautiful, said, isn't this all great? Traditional hierarchies, I like these things. And his rational mind would go in and say, look, not a lot of this actually makes sense, but I know I likes it, and we know it works, so why don't we keep it? And you don't need much more rationale than that, but obviously with leftists, you don't have the advantage of most people like what you are putting forward, and you also don't have the advantage of time on your side, showing that your experiments work, so you have to hyper-rationalise, because you literally have nothing else. And that's not to say rationalising things is completely useless, of course it isn't. The way the rational mind works has meant that we've made multiple scientific discoveries and made massive progress when it comes to engineering, medicine, and, well, many other things in life. But when it comes to how is it best to run society, rationale doesn't appear to work, because society is filled to the brim with irrational beings, so of course rationality isn't going to be the best thing for them. But anyway, that's about everything I have for you today. So once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.